Good afternoon, QED. How are we?
Hey!
Good morning for anyone who's just got out of bed after the last night. We didn't wake you up with a fire alarm this morning. So we are here to actually talk about sex. My name is Lana. You might remember me for such wonderful panels yesterday as the parenting panel. Turns out this one's relevant. And the neurodiversity panel. So with me today, we have, from left to right, we've got Justin Hancock,
Hello.
Alice Howarth, hello, and Tom Shakespeare. Wonderful. So we're going to start with introductions. I'm not going to introduce anyone. I would love it if you would all introduce yourselves, please.
Great. So I'm Justin Hancock. Young people love me making jokes about my name.
It's a great name considering what you do.
Yeah, nominative determinism. That's the at the beginning of lessons, I sometimes say, look, I'm going to teach you about nominative determinism, and if you learn nothing else, at least you can say that I taught you a thing. Apparently, a lot of butlers are called Jeeves. Who knew? I'm a sex and relationships educator working with young people and adults. I do many different, probably some would say too many different projects, but I guess the main things that I do are bishuk.com, which is my website for young people, one of the leading websites online. There aren't very many good ones, so it's quite easy for me to say that. It gets thousands of young people visiting every day, and it's really inclusive and political, and constantly gets attacked by the right-wing press. So if you want to go check that out and support it and show your love, that would be wonderful. I do a podcast as well called Culture, Sex, Relationships, which is, you know what a podcast is. I sometimes work in schools, I train teachers, and I've written 2 books which are available downstairs. I'll even sign some for you if you want. One is called Can We Talk About Consent, which is written for teenage audience, and the other one is called A Practical Guide to Sex, which is written for an adult audience. No pictures though, sadly, which I co-wrote with Meg John Barker, who the awesome writer of Queer and many other books.
I'm Alice. Some of you might know me from my podcast Skeptics with a K, where I very frequently talk about sex and the anatomy of different people who have used genitals for different things. So that's kind of where I'm coming from this on this panel.
My name's Tom Shakespeare, and I'm a social researcher, and I did a book, 1996, called Sexual Politics and Disability with Kath Gillespie-Sells and Dominic Davis, and 20 years later I did a follow-up with a friend of mine called Sarah, which was imaginatively 20 years on. Currently I'm doing some work about older people and sexuality in China and Britain.
Wonderful, brilliant. Okay, so we're here to talk about sex, so we should probably start at the beginning. Justin, you explain sex every day, so maybe you could explain sex to me.
Well, that is a much bigger question than I thought we were going to start with.
So specifically the question that Alice has very helpfully written for me, thank you very much, Alice, is what do we mean when we say sex? Because it's such a blanket term, right?
Yeah. Well, we actually cover this in our book, A Practical Guide to Sex, and it's actually a really important philosophical question we could all be asking ourselves, because I guess just first and foremost, what we get with sex in sex education and also in kind of dominant discourses around sex and relationships is that we get a certain set of messages around the purpose of sex and who has sex and the kinds of sex that we should have. And every time I run a training course with whoever I've been doing training courses now since 2003. One of the common activities I do is to ask whoever's on the course to talk about what their sex ed was like. And pretty much everyone on the course says, well, we didn't get very much. We're told that it was scary and awkward and we shouldn't talk about it. We were told that it was about penis and vagina sex. We were told that it was about reproduction. We were told that pregnancy was terrible and that STIs were awful, and that it was only about the straight experience and disability was never mentioned. Bisexuality, homosexuality, never mentioned. And it was grim, and they hated it. And that's what everyone says. And so this is a kind of... so by asking, what is sex, or kind of what else is sex, what we're doing is kind of challenging that kind of dominant narrative that we have about sex. And I would say, just to throw in a bit of a fancy word, I would say it's hegemonic. So hegemonic is that it becomes this idea that it is common sense. This idea that, well, of course sex is about reproduction, penis, vagina kind of thing. That goes in here, to do my kind of Jeremy Clarkson / Alan Partridge voice. But we are taught to think that. And the reason that we are taught to think that is patriarchy and also capitalism. And so it's actually no coincidence that during the 20th century, during the high peak of capitalist modes of production, Henry Ford, for example, so the period from the 1920s to the late 1960s is called Fordism, named after Henry Ford. And basically part of his deal to workers was, I'll pay you more, but you have to run your families in a particular way. You have to have kids. You can't be gay. You can't do anything which is seen as not normal. And so this kind of hegemonic idea, these dominant discourses, are taken up by capitalist and also right-wing projects, which I might talk about later, and are used. But actually, we have to question that common sense and be critical about it and be critical thinkers about sex. But that's very difficult to do because we're also taught that you shouldn't talk about it and that it's awkward. And so actually even talking about this and having this is a kind of part of a counter-hegemonic project. It's kind of, important, possibly revolutionary post-capitalist thing to do.
Right. So, Tom, we've got these stories that we're taught in school that the boys and the girls are separated off, and the girls are taught special things about periods, and the boys are, I don't know, taught about football or whatever they get. But
Get to put a condom on a banana.
is that what they do? Right. Okay. Wild. I thought they did the offside rule. I'll be honest.
That's why none of us girls know anything about it.
Obviously, I can tell you a lot about Overwatch, though. So, Tom, how do these stories that are kind of reinforced by society about sex should be penis and vagina, sex should be man and woman, sex should be this? How does this be harmful for people with disabilities?
And I think that the first thing to say is that it's a taboo. I think disabled people are meant to be asexual. Men, I'm using that word in inverted commas. Disabled people are not meant to be on panels talking about sex. Because a lot of disabled people don't get good sex education, and because, it's back to Adam Rutherford and the idea of eugenics. The fear of disabled people reproducing is that there'll be more disabled people. So whatever complicated ideas underpin it, and one of the anecdotes that we were told when we were doing research was about two disabled people who kissed in a supermarket, and somebody came up to them and said, "Do you mind? It's bad enough that there are two of you." And that was said. So there is a widespread taboo against and a thought that disability is about asexuality. So that's the first thing. If disability is not about asexuality, it's about deviant sexuality. It's about rampaging dwarfs or dangerous, dangerous people with intellectual disability or mad people or whatever. It's this stereotypical negativity about sex. So either there is no sex or there's a negativity about sex. And I think that it has been challenged now, but now you often get, and I think that, on the one hand it's true, on the other hand it's problematic, which is that when disability and sex are mentioned in the same breath, it's always about abuse of disabled people. It's always about sex being bad. And it is true that there's high levels of abuse of disabled people, that disabled people are seen as easy targets for abuse, or they're not able to disclose abuse for whatever reason, and obviously disabled people are more likely to be in institutions, so sexual and physical abuse are common among disabled people, but we ought to be able to actually talk about the joy of sex.
Yeah.
We ought to be able to talk about positivity about sex. And one final thing, when we, an Australian group and I did research about masculinity, and what we found is that there is a sort of liberation of being disabled, which is that you don't have to conform. You can be a man in your own way. You can be sexual in your own way. Sometimes you have to be, because what is presented to you, and I think you're quite right, I agree with Justin, the sort of hegemonic notion of masculinity is not available. And therefore, either you're really macho, and anybody who's seen the film Murderball, that's macho, wheelchair-using, bashing people. That's not what many disabled people want or can do, and therefore they have to do it a bit differently. But that's liberation. That's really good.
Absolutely. Once you exist outside of those norms, and anyway, empowering people to push back on that.
It's both a negativity. You can't be as it were normal, but it's also paradoxically a liberation. You don't have to be like that.
Wonderful. Amazing. It's one of the things we see increasingly, which makes QED so wonderful, is like the diversity of you guys are amazing. And I love being here among people who just feel so happy to be themselves, right? So Alice, how does this narrow definition of what sex should be harm women?
Yes, so this is and this is where this basic idea of sex should be penis and vagina is a major issue. Obviously, there are plenty of people who don't have a penis or a vagina in their sexual relationship, which means that just doesn't work. Does that mean that two people with vaginas having sex are not having sex? Does that mean that's not really proper real sex? But then on top of that, we've got issues with the pressure that is put onto particularly women to conform to that type of sex, penis and vagina sex, which can be particularly problematic for women who have health conditions, things like endometriosis, vulvodynia, where they penetrative sex might not be physically possible. They might go through periods of their lives where it is not physically possible, where they have to adapt their sex lives in order to enjoy sexuality. That can put a lot of pressure socially onto those people that, am I not a woman? Am I not feminine if I can't have penis and vagina sex, if I can't have penetrative sex? But then there's all these other issues about what we've been told what sex should be, that men can always orgasm on demand. Basically, you just need to look in the direction of his penis and it will be hard and it'll be ready to go and he will orgasm instantly. Of course, that's damaging to men as well, because there's plenty of men or people with penises who will struggle to achieve erection, who will struggle to orgasm, who will may also struggle with penetration. But it's also this kind of pressure on women to I'm doing something wrong if I can't make my partner with a penis get erect when he needs to be. And there's all of that pressure associated with it. And then we've got all of the conversations around orgasm. So men are expected, or people with penises are expected to orgasm very, very easily. And so that's the end goal. That's the goal of sex, is to put the penis in the vagina, the penis orgasms, all done, winner. Sex is complete. Tick, we've done the job.
Next up, wash the dishes.
And then he's really tired and he can't give you what you need. And that now we're starting to have conversations about the female orgasm, and that is really important. And those are great conversations, and it is really important that we have those conversations. But now it becomes goal-directed in the other direction, that now you're less of a man if you don't make your partner with a vulva orgasm. You're less... it is your responsibility to do it the right way, and there's pressure on the people with the vaginas to orgasm through penetrative sex, which is incredibly difficult for the majority of women. Penetrative sex is, for most women, is not the way that we orgasm. And so we have to talk about all the different ways that people get pleasure, physical pleasure, from the acts that we partake in, and how we can redress the balance. And also bear in mind that not all people enjoy orgasming. Some people would prefer to just have non-goal-directed sex and enjoy the sensations and enjoy the pleasure, and not not have to have that pressure of I must orgasm because otherwise I'm going to let down my partner. I must orgasm because the sex positivity world tells me that my relationship is broken if I'm not getting to orgasm in the way that I want to.
It's such a pressure, right? And the minute you put pressure on sex, it instantaneously
all stops working,
becomes not fun anymore. And these questions, and certainly what Justin was talking about in terms of our sex education and how that sex education forms our idea of what sex should be, totally excludes gay, lesbian, non-binary, trans. Like I work on the internet, I produce content, the communities I produce it for are LGBTQI, and it's like nothing exists out there, and you get so many like young people on the internet. Like I play video games, people come and watch me and they talk to me, and then they're coming to me, their heart in their hands, and I'm out as a queer woman. They're like, I've got this date with this girl, and what do I do? Like, and the places that you get that information from is terrible. Like, and I know that my son is of an age, he's 12, and hasn't disclosed anything about his sexuality to me yet. But the sexual education he is getting inside of school is entirely heteronormative. There is no exposure to anything outside of this is penis. Even today, 2022, right? This is penis and vagina and sex. You must not get STIs. You must use condoms. This is pregnancy. Nothing else. Like, how do we challenge that narrative? How do we educate ourselves, like both online and also the younger generation that we're exposed to?
I mean, a word here in support of teachers. Teachers are having to deliver relationships and sex education without being trained, because the school either can't afford it or won't pay for it because it's an incredibly low status subject in school. But also they haven't received good RSE themselves either. They don't know what good looks like or feels like, and they're having to deal with the same.
I can't find out because we're not allowed to talk about it.
Yeah, and they're dealing with the same kinds of issues that the young people that they're working with are dealing for themselves. Everyone, anyone who, even asexual or aromantic folk are still in some way dealing with their relationship to sex and relationships. And there was actually a really good paper about this, about teaching about consent in school and the dilemmas. I think it's called The Dilemmas of Teaching Consent Education in School. I mentioned in it. They said my resources were great, one of the teachers was saying, well, I'm here meant to be teaching about consent. I've got no resources. I can't pay for resources. And I myself I've experienced consent violations. Like, how am I meant to hold this lesson? So there are material reasons why sex and relationships education isn't great, and that's hegemonic, right? If we wanted to make a difference, the government would pay to make a difference by paying for teachers. Also, the other thing I should say is that back in the day when I've been doing this since I've been a sex educator since 1999. When I started, I was working for a specialist youth work team who were delivering and supporting schools in delivering relationships and sex education, also working in youth clubs and youth projects and care homes, care settings. We set up drop-in sessions for young people coming in to get themselves educated about sex and relationships, particularly young men who are coming in to get condoms and to get info and advice and pointed in the right direction. That specialist youth work team no longer exists. That youth service no longer exists. So the cuts have been austerity has been absolutely devastating. A lot of the charities who work in this sector, I'm not going to name them because I don't want to kind of draw attention to something which is a problem. But one of the leading charities that has basically gone. The other one has faced a series of cuts, and I run a website that gets 7,000 young people visiting every day, and I'm reliant on 160 patrons to keep it going. So we do also have to look at this in the round, which is society treats it as a low status subject. It's not being given funding. It's not being given the status, and that's kind of where we are. So we have to kind of look at this kind of societally, as well as to look at how, on an individual level, we can use our micropolitics as individuals to make it better, which is a lot of what I do.
It seems like an insurmountable problem at times, right? Because if you're going to have that, if you're going to go to the government and say, we need to prioritise this is important, and the government says to the population, this is important, we want to put money into this, well, people will start to look around with those hegemonic beliefs that, well, hang on, the world is on fire, why are we spending money on something as inconsequential as sex education?
Right. But then, whenever people, I'm on the left, surprise, surprise, but, I often hear on the left, sex and relationships education isn't a relevant subject for the left. Yet, the other week, Cabinet Secretary was talking about Bonk for Britain, which is this horrendously eugenicist kind of idea of certain kinds of people, certain kinds of races, certain kinds of people being encouraged to reproduce. So these kinds of discourses are used by the far right. The far right are very comfortable talking about this stuff, but the left and the centre and liberal, not so much.
I just want to add to what you said there. My work is on disability, so I will talk about that. But there's a woman called Anne Finger, who's you grist for your nominative determinism. But Anne Finger is a great woman, and what she said, and I'm misquoting her, but it's a quote that's used in a lot of disability, sexuality stuff, which is that, yes, we fight for housing, we fight for incomes, and we fight for access and all the rest of it. But in a way, the most important right, the deepest right, is sexuality, because that is real acceptance. That's real. Two people, when a disabled person is in a relationship, whatever or more, whatever sort of relationship, that is real acceptance, and that is what we're fighting for. And therefore, all of our discussion, and I think it's not just true of disabled people, it's true of everybody. Because when you are accepted and loved, or having fun and with somebody or some people, that is acceptance. And that is, when a young person or a disabled person or an older person or a woman or a gay person or a trans person is part of the whole. And that's what we aspire to and long for. So I do think it's really foundational in the sort of society, the sort of world we want to live in.
Especially when we would often say that sex is one of our fundamental human basic needs. It's part of our humanity.
It's certainly part of our humanity.
It's the way it's perceived, and so you can only be part of humanity if you're in sexual
we talk a lot about it, and we were last night Saturday in Manchester, and any city centre in the land is the same, but there's I'm sure Russell would agree, sure you all agree, there's a really narrow notion of what counts.
Absolutely.
And it excludes anybody who's older, anybody who's got a different body shape, many people who have, there's so many gay people we talk to who do not feel they belong on the gay scene because their bodies are slightly different, or they're not, dancing high energy or whatever it might be. And that's not criticism of the gay scene. It's to say there should be different options.
Should be diversity.
And there should be acceptance of the different ways in which people relate to each other and to themselves, to their bodies.
And of course, it will also affect those people who are asexual but choose not to partake in sexual relationships. Should also be included in all of our.
I mean, the fact that doesn't mean you're not a person.
Exactly.
And it's the same. If we look at who we don't think are persons, they tend to be people who don't have sex. And disabled people are not thought of to be as persons because they don't have sex. Older people are not thought of as persons because they're thought not to have sex. And I do think as soon as you're outside that sort of, you've called it heteronormative core, as soon as you're outside that, you're a non-person. And I think that's problematic for all of us.
Absolutely. So QED is not about doom and gloom, despite what
our entire content seems to have said so far.
Absolutely. Despite which Prime Minister are we on now? What is it, Sunday?
I haven't checked in the last 2 days.
Well, clocks went back, so that gave them a bit more time to install a new one,
are we back to the lettuce, or is it forward to Rishi? Anyway, so despite what's going on in the world, we've solved it, right? The sex positivity movement is everywhere, right? It's on Instagram, it's Tumblr a thing anymore? I can't remember. I haven't checked it since they did that thing.
Tumblr was making a bit of a comeback.
I think they've allowed porn again.
So it is now relevant for our panel.
They've allowed porn again, so they probably might be in business still.
So definitely making a comeback.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's sex positive. So Instagram, I haven't looked at Facebook in years. It's over Twitter. It's over TikTok's full of it. I love TikTok.
No one talks about sex on Facebook because it's all older people, and older people don't have sex.
That's true. We've established that they're not allowed sex. I've probably got another week or so before they put me in the bin. So we've solved it, right, Alice?
Oh God, I'm kind of in two minds on the sex positivity movement because I think it comes from a good place. It's well intentioned, and in its very foundations, it was really important. We weren't having any of these conversations, and I've been kind of part of different communities for a long time having these conversations. I used to be part of a sex positive forum that kind of started many years ago, and that was actually originally run by the company Love Honey, who now pitch themselves as the sexual happiness people, it was a good, warm, positive, friendly place to be, and we're having positive conversations. But it's kind of become, as all conversations do and seem to these days, become this very binary, black and white construct where you now have to fit within the norms of the sex positivity world. You now have to be desperate to make sure that the person in your mono or poly relationship with a vagina or vulva has to orgasm, and that is priority number one, even if they don't want to. It has become this very prescriptive conversation that is not always thinking about all the different diversity that we should be thinking about, and it's just become, well, this is the answer and this is where we focus and we talk about these things now, and it's maybe setting up a new hegemony that is prescriptive in a different way and not having those delightful conversations that we should have.
And those definitions seem to change, right?
Yeah.
A conversation by conversation in person that you have, it's like this person has one very narrow set of definitions about what sex positive is. Oh, and you accept this, but you have to. That doesn't count. That's something else. So it's so much policing of what's allowed and what is.
And that means that many people within that movement won't even consider. So they might be having more conversations that are less heteronormative, less mononormative, and opening up the conversation that way. But in no way are they considering the fact that not everybody could have sex in a bed because they might not be easily able to get into the bed in the spur of the moment. And that we're not thinking about accessibility in the bedroom. We're not thinking about all of the different ways in which sex positivity could be brought to different groups of people who need additional conversations to be had.
I'm remembering the memoir of, I want to hear what Justin said, but I'm remembering the memoir that you might have come across of Penny Pepper, and I remember interviewing her. Penny Pepper is a writer, and she's been very involved in the BDSM world and the kink world, and what she said when I interviewed her was that she felt that world was much more accepting of difference, because once everybody is different, then your difference is just another kink, it's just another interest. And therefore she felt there wasn't so much judgmentalism or so much pigeonholing in that world, and she felt it was very progressive. Now, I'm not saying you're wrong, of course you're right, but I think that, I suppose when we say anything goes, that's really good, but as long as we don't then say, but this is what goes, and the women orgasm or the men orgasm or the whatever, we'd have to do it like this. I think we have to be truly open to the possibilities. Yeah.
Absolutely. So the reason I'm chairing this panel is, and not everyone here is going to know, apart from everyone on YouTube and anyone who watches me on Twitch, but I've taught a shibari class, which is a type of like rope bondage where sometimes we suspend people from ceilings and stuff for the past 10 years up here in the Northwest. And we are probably at that thing that we described where those other communities can be much more accepting towards people who are already different. But I would say we're quite individual, where we have one of the most accessible spaces in the Northwest. A lot of the venues, because we're already on the outside, it's very difficult to find venues that are accessible. We specialize in teaching ways in which the stuff that we can do can be made as safe, because it's never safe, can be made as safe as possible for different body types, for different people with accessibility needs. I've rigged up a wheelchair. It was a lot of fun. The person had a great time, and it was something that they had never got to experience before, because everybody else had looked at that situation and gone, no, because this kind of stuff only happens between a middle-aged white guy and a very skinny lady. And that person's not allowed to partake in this activity, right? And this is something that we see even within a movement that's supposed to be sex positive and supposed to be like, hey, we're doing stuff that's different. It can be very prescriptive about what it is and how it works, right? So, Justin, sex positivity. How does it fix? Do we call Patreon, tell them to cancel it all, or?
I'm not sex positive. I'm sex ambivalent. I'm sex. Sometimes I'm sex enthusiastic. Sometimes I'm sex. Anyway, I'll talk about that in a bit. But I think it's. I try not to be too critical about it, because many of my friends and colleagues are sex positive, and so I don't want to just be the fun sponge, which is one of my nicknames. Surprisingly, strangely, my mum's local pub started serving a beer called Fun Sponge. I'm like, is this just one big name? I can understand what sex positivity is trying to do, and TV shows like Sex and the City opened up a door, right? So let's say everything that I was talking about at the beginning, let's call that, so we'll keep throwing the word hegemonic around. When we say hegemonic, we mean common sense, like kind of received wisdom. So sex positivity was about basically replacing the sex negative set of discourses, sex negative hegemonic way of thinking. I'm about to use another fancy academic word, discourses, with another range of discourses, which are like sex positive, and basically a lot of them are just kind of like the opposite. So it's like it's reframing sex. So instead of sex being about reproduction, sex is now about pleasure. Instead of just kind of being something you just get through, sex can now be orgasmic. Instead of sex only being about something you practice with another person in the bonds of a deeply loving, committed relationship, you can have a wank, or you can have a lot of solo sex, which is good. It's opened up a lot of doors. We still don't see solo sex as being as equal and valid a form of sex as partner sex. So, I can understand why, and so it's opened up a lot of things, but it does run the risk of replacing one hegemonic idea with another, or replacing one set of discourses with another. When there are discourses, when there is this common sense idea, there is power. Not to go massively into Foucault at the moment, but that when we start to define things as something and say that this is the preferred way of going about doing sex and relationships, it creates the opportunity for power. And who has harnessed that power? Well, grumpy leftist over here, pharmaceutical companies, and sex toy industry, and many of them are doing great things, which is fine. Get your sex toys from a post-capitalist company who invest in their staff and are clear about their practices and where they buy from and how much profit they're making, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so there's that, but also I think often they do end up saying quite similar things about sex. I think that sometimes sex positivity is still about couples, and it is still about fucking, and it is still about doing something normative but kind of slightly better and slightly spicier. So as a famous bit of sex advice, I think. No, I'm not going to name people. I don't like dunking on people. But a very famous sex advice person who earns a lot more money from doing something not as well as I do said that but I'm not going to name them, said, oh, if you want to spice things up in the bedroom, you could imagine having sex with somebody else. Do it in front of a mirror. And I think, well, there'd be two other people there, and they'd look like you, wouldn't they? So you kind of doing it. Anyway.
I think that was an episode of Doctor Who, wasn't it?
Yeah, possibly. I wouldn't
remember
know.
those cosmopolitan sex advice things that were just...
Right, but Cosmo's got a lot better. So I'm trying not to.
Yeah.
I'm trying not to be incredibly grumpy, but also I think what it does is, and this is like So I'm going to throw another this is theory corner over here as well. So when we talk about sex positivity, it creates a dialectic, it creates a dialogue. So that means if you're not sex positive, you're sex negative. And so what does it do? It simply reifies sex negative as being the default, and that we need to not do that and therefore be sex positive. So in that way, I don't think it fully can embrace the possibilities for opening up and doing
Do we need it sex
anything.
neutral? Is that what we need?
We need sex critical. We need critical sexology, which I'm happy to drone on and on, if you like.
Okay. Right. So, Tom, sex positivity claims to be inclusive. Is it? Does it?
I don't think I'm too old to have any view on sex positivity. But what I do think that if we want to be inclusive, because I think that's what you're aiming at, I think we have to talk to people, and I think we have to have more conversations. And I would say that I'm a qualitative social researcher. I like talking to people, and I think that. If the trouble is that the national conversation, if you like, has been dominated by fewer voices, and as you said, a lot of them are very commercialised in terms of selling things. But I think if we actually, sex is what we do. Sex is normal, and if we are able to talk about it and to listen to people talking about it, and to talk about it without shame or guilt or any of those negative feelings, but to say, this is what I do, and sometimes on my own, sometimes with people, and it's great, usually, not always, and I don't have to do it for a while, and all the rest of it. So I'm a great believer in talking to people and gathering their stories. And I think if we have more stories, we'll have better sex.
That's exactly why I wanted us to have this sort of panel at QED, because I think even within our circle, in the skeptical social circle, we don't talk about sex enough. People are quite shy about it. They feel embarrassed about it. They don't feel confident talking about it or asking questions about it. And gaining that confidence and having those conversations is a great way to start those discussions.
I remember right at the beginning of the crisis around AIDS and HIV, and well, it wasn't right at the beginning, but it certainly in the early 90s, we did a project, community ed project in Gateshead called the Great Sex, Drugs and Rock and Roll Tour. And we went round to pubs and we talked, we had a quiz, stupid quiz, with condoms and lube and all the rest of it as prizes. But the point, the aim of it was to get people talking about sex. And if you're, I was silly and, do you know how fast sperm travels? You probably don't, do you? 7 miles an hour, unless it's ejaculate, which is 20 miles an hour. So, many facts like that and quiz like that. And the whole point was to have the whole pub talking about sex and saying sex was not one thing, it was anything. And it was all fun if you did it right. And people went home happy and sometimes with lube and tried something different and realised that that people were different. I think that's really important. Yeah. If we're going to have safe sex, if we're going to have inclusive sex, if we're going to have sex with where different members of the community or the population feel it's got something for them.
And especially as touching on the HIV. Period. We're still in it. People still living with HIV. I think one thing we don't do so well, and maybe we need to start doing a lot better, is that we kind of just think, well, we've had all those scare stories as we were children that sexually transmitted diseases are the worst thing in the world and they're terrible and sex is scary because you could get one of them. Actually, there are lots of people living with long-term chronic illnesses and conditions that have been sexually transmitted, and those people have sex too, and you can have safe sex with those people, and we can have those conversations rather than just closing that down.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and this is the bit where I'm going to sound a bit less grumpy, hopefully. Well, I'll say things that are not grumpy, but it'll still be the same tone of voice, so you won't know the difference.
I'm going to go home with that word fun sponge.
So, and so I think that, so what we need to do is to think of the micro ways in which we can actually affect change. It all sounds, I mean, another problem with sex positivity as well is that it kind of imagines that there's a level playing field for everyone, where everyone has the same degree of sexual agency, the same degree of same power in society, and they don't. You can't step outside of culture, and sex positivity lives inside of culture. And what does that culture say, as we've been discussing? It affords some people more sexual agency than others, people with disabilities, but also there's a lot of we're not talked about race yet, but you know, in the stigma around that's created around sex and relationships, there's a lot of stigma, racialized stigma as well, and that is also used by the far right. As I kind of mentioned before. But even despite all of that, right, so it all sounds quite grim at the moment. We were brought up with sex negativity, then which didn't equip us to talk about sex and made us feel like it was a scary, shameful, stigmatizing subject. And you're not meant to enjoy it. You're meant to kind of lie back and think of England for some reason. Why?
Because England will definitely get you in the mood.
Why that's going to do it for anyone. Though these days they'll throw you in prison for saying anything about England. That's like a leftist meme. And then we're also saying, you know, sex positivity has its real problems as well. It opens some things up, but it also closes some things down. But really what we need to think of is Michel Foucault was also a grumpy bastard, but at the end of his career, he said, look, you can't step outside of culture. Discourses around how we're supposed to live our lives are used to discipline and punish us, and also we do that to ourselves, and so we can't escape discourse. Towards the end of his life, he's like, do you know what? I feel a bit differently about this now. And so he came up with this idea of technologies of the self. And so what we need are technologies of the self, which are, how do we ask ourselves critical and interesting and curious questions that help us to become? And I'm going to use another philosopher here. I'm going to talk about Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, French philosophers, who talk about becoming other. So what can we do in order to become our sexual selves? And that our sexual self doesn't exist in a kind of a fixed state, but it is constantly in a state of becoming. What kinds of questions, what kinds of technologies in terms of any kind of technology, therapy as a technology, a relationship as a technology, a notepad as a technology, this is a technology. How can we make use of those things to become other, to be this constantly changing sexual subject who may or may not have sex? And so that is what good sex and relationships education is. It's not filling people's heads with more discourse. It's giving people tools. And so my latest kind of like mantra is resources, not discourses. So unless we're giving people the opportunity to have those conversations, we're not doing anything for them. We're just kind of talking at them in the same way that I'm doing at you right now. So one activity that you could, and also there's lots more of this in my book I wrote with Meg John, which is downstairs. I will sign a copy for you. It's quite cheap. It's the best sex advice book ever written. Whole chapter on consent. But one thing that you could think of is try to bring to mind a really useful conversation that you've had about sex and relationships in your life. You know, you've grown up with sex negativity, you've been bombarded with sex positive messages, yet you've probably had at least one really useful conversation about sex and relationships in your life at some stage. What was present? What was there? What made it easier? And if you think about that, you might find, I've been doing this activity recently, I've got some notes from a previous activity, the environment, fidget toys, trusted the person, had confidence in them. We had like a variety of options. We could talk about this or not talk about this. We had the right kind of eye contact where we weren't just staring at each other, but we were also paying attention to each other. We gave each other time and space and patience. You know, that is what we need. And so sex positivity sometimes doesn't give us that, but that's the work I'm trying to do, that kind of stuff.
Wonderful. Okay, so going on from conversations, we've got a very brief amount of time for some audience questions if we have them. Now, I'm going to pop over there to get the box. Just talk amongst yourselves.
I just wanted to add, while we're finding the questions, that a lot of it's actually quite material. So if you're disempowered, if you don't have enough money, if you're not able to get into the places like the pubs and clubs, if you're not able to buy the smart clothes, it's very difficult to feel very confident about yourself, because we live in a world where if you're not part of that scene, you're not anybody. And so I do think we need to say, you don't have to be, you can still have that conversation. You can still have those technologies, even if you're excluded. And more than that, we need to be able to enable more people to feel confident by accessing what it takes to be confident. Yeah. Sorry.
Absolutely, no, that is the thing. The idea, and I think it's where I criticise the sex positivity movement, is it's like, okay, you're allowed sex, you're allowed to feel good about yourself if you look like this, or if you do these things, or if you're on social media, or which excludes, and even though it tries to be inclusive of things, people with disabilities, it's like only these sorts of disabilities. And we're not going to talk about people with stomas. That's disgusting. And or we're not going to talk about people with intellectual disabilities because, well, that's a whole other thing. Yeah. Anyway. So, questions. If you could put your hand up, I'm going to hand a box over, and then if you could try and migrate the box over to someone else, and we'll go as many as we have. A question starts, and it's a whole sentence, and it finishes with a question mark. If we can try and keep it as brief as we can, that would be lovely. Right, I'm going to start there, and then if we could pop it over to that side of the room.
So I've seen a lot of using social awkwardness as an excuse for someone not getting proper consent. And as someone with autism, I find that pretty offensive, actually. And so you've talked about a lot of different diversity. I'm just sort of curious where neurodivergence fits into this conversation about sex and consent.
Justin, you've written a book on consent.
I have, yes. Well, everybody's neurodivergences are unique. The thing that a lot of folk who are say, let's say, neuroatypical find is that because sex educators often don't really get into the nitty-gritty of how communication actually works, that the resources are never very helpful. So really, it's about looking at, and the work on, there's been some very interesting work done on consent by an academic called Tina Sicker. She's written this fantastic book called Sex, Consent and Justice. It's an academic book, but I did an interview with her for my podcast, which is free. And so she's talking about, and what I talk about in my book is that basically we need to look at all of the different ways that our bodies communicate with each other. So using kind of embodied cognition, words, phrases, pats, taps, yes, no, maybe lists, before, during, and after check-ins, and that we need to be doing all of these all of the time. But also, it's not that hard, because we know we need breaks during sex. We all have needs during sex, either to be in a more comfortable position, to need a water break, to have a loo break, or some kind of toileting break, or just to get our breath back. Sometimes orgasm can be too much. French word for that is jouissance. Sometimes it can be disturbing and overwhelming, and actually some people really don't like them. And so we have to basically use all of the communication skills that are available to us in those moments. And those communicative moments are also kind of co-created. So it's also really important to be able to find your own language. And so that means that we also need to talk about talking. So one of the kind of a nice way of doing this is to say, well, what kinds of the communication methods are most useful for you before we talk about it. And again, this is all about, we are not taught this. We are taught never talk about it, just get on with it, because for heaven's sake, you might enjoy it or do something that isn't PIV. So talking about talking, meta-communication, and but also kind of going slowly enough that you can allow for sex to become. You can over-plan sex, so it's about talking as frankly as we can about what our bodies do, how our bodies react, and the potential meanings for us in doing that.
It's interesting. Like, as somebody who's recently diagnosed autistic, I was referred on for this 12-week course, how to be autistic, what you should do if you're autistic. I'm not entirely sure what the premise was, but it was valuable. It was really useful, and they had one entire session dedicated to sex and relationships and dating. It was very much pitched at dating, how to date successfully, and I think some of it's difficult because it can become this, oh well, autistic people are therefore terrible at dating and they need these special rules and special instructions and they need to be told how to not accidentally breach somebody's consent. But actually, I think there are much more positive ways that we can have those conversations and say, do you know what, sexual relationships with another person or other people are social interactions. Some people with autism and with other divergent conditions might struggle with some of those social interactions, and there are tools that we can provide to make that more sensible. And if we're having sex education that is inclusive, that is giving people the tools that, do you know what, these are the different ways in which people can consent, and these are the different ways in which you can ask for people's consent, and make it an open conversation that people can be part of and learn the tools that they need for all social interactions, but let's include sex and relationships in those interactions. I think you're right. I think it's majorly problematic that we assume consent violations are coming from people who are socially awkward, who are misreading the situation, who are autistic in all of those ways, because that just kind of, it feeds into so many other problems, and it makes it scary and difficult for people who are autistic. I'm really bad at social situations. I don't want to accidentally violate somebody's consent, and so I'm just going to withdraw from all of these situations and overthink it and become overly anxious in ways that autistic people already have enough of.
I think most neurotypical people are terrible at consent, and the statistics would prove that.
Yeah.
Objectively speaking.
Because often neurotypical people, and just in that general society, instead of relying on active asking the question, asking, are you okay with this? Are you enjoying this? Are we having fun? They are looking for body language cues and things that are easy to misread.
Yeah, we are. If we stop talking euphemisms so much, we might move somewhere, especially, and that would be a more inclusive conversation. Right, we've got one very quick conversation.
So maybe bearing in mind sex positivity and who the voices in that space are, and looking at the makeup of this room, because it doesn't appear to be for a lack of interest. Why do men in particular panic when you try to talk about sex with them?
I'm bowing out of this one.
Sex, about...
Why do men in particular seem to have a difficulty talking about panic? Often when I talk about this, with sex, they just panic and don't want to engage and shut down.
Shall I do it? Well, we both have.
Have you got anything to say, Tom?
Always. I think that sex is obviously difficult for lots of different people, but I think there's a particular expectation that men will be good at this, men will be powerful at this, men will, all the things about erections and penetration and all the rest of it, the men will be in charge. And I think that is problematic for everybody, but also for men. And I think some of what you suggest may be to do with that. And I think the sooner that we can liberate everybody, including men, from that expectation, the better. And, we all fuck up, we're all useless, and let's just try and enjoy what we have. Sorry, you were going to say something about men.
I completely agree with all of that. But again, it's to do with how sex is. Strong masculinities, like, I keep using the word hegemonic, I'm really sorry, but like strong common sense ideas of masculinity those men are meant to do sex in a way which is, where they're not actually really meant to enjoy it. Like, there is this thing where, like, on the alt-right, that you're basically a bit gay to enjoy having sex with a woman. It's like, it's kind of, you're less of a man. And basically that boils down to kind of humour theory and the idea that, so I've got my girlfriend's medieval historian, the idea that men are meant to be hot and dry and women are meant to be cold and wet. And you can't heat the woman up too much, because when the woman gets too hot, cities burn down, real talk. So these the kind of human theory idea of masculinity, which also comes from Aristotle, who has a lot to answer for, is that men are meant to kind of like get in and out and not really enjoy it very much. So if you watch porn with men and women, which I do, you'll notice that the men barely make a sound. They're like, you know, robots, like sexy robots with hard penises, and when they orgasm, it's like a thing has happened, and you know, so they're depicting kind of like masculinity as it should be. Like, you shouldn't be talking about it, you shouldn't be soft, you shouldn't be vulnerable, you shouldn't be talking about what you may or may not enjoy, because you're not a real man if you do. So it's, yeah, I completely agree with that we need to dismantle it in some way as part of a post-capitalist project, obviously, but yeah.
Right, that is all we have time for. So thank you very much to our panelists.